She traveled 3,000 miles to marry a man she'd never met, and he rejected her in front of the entire town. No family, no money, no one willing to stand beside her. Most women would have gotten back on that train. Amelia Whitmore sat down on a platform bench, picked up her bag, and started figuring out what came next. What happened over the following 8 months would change everything. For a lonely widower who had forgotten what a real home felt like. For 2 children still carrying grief they didn't have words for. And for a town that had already decided who she was before she'd spoken a single word. This is a story about what it actually takes to build a life from nothing. Not luck, not rescue. Just one woman's refusal to let someone else's bad decision become the end of her story. If that sounds like something worth watching until the end, stay with us. Hit like. So this story finds someone who needs it today. Drop your city and country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this has traveled. And subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what's coming next. Our family is waiting for you. The train pulled into Silver Creek on a Tuesday afternoon in late September of 1885, and Amelia Whitmore stepped onto the platform carrying everything she owned in one hand. The bag was brown leather, scuffed at both corners, the brass clasp bent slightly from being dropped once during the transfer in Cheyenne. She had not thought to hide it or feel ashamed of it until that moment, when she stepped off the last step and looked up and found herself facing what felt like half the town. They had gathered the way people gather for something worth watching, casually, with arms folded, eyes moving. A few women stood near the station house door. A group of men leaned against the hitching post across the street. Children wove between adult legs without much attention paid to them. The air smelled of coal dust and dry grass, and the faint sweetness of something baking somewhere nearby. And for one brief moment, Amelia let herself think. This could be a beginning. She was 26 years old, not a girl, not quite old by frontier standards, but old enough to know that hope was something you carried carefully, the way you'd carry something already cracked. She had corresponded with Victor Hale for 8 months. 41 letters, most of them his, some of them longer than she'd expected from a man of his reputation. He wrote about the land, the way the hills looked at first frost, the particular blue of the sky in Wyoming in October, the size of his cattle operation, and the ambitions he still had for it. He wrote about his first wife, briefly, and with what she'd read as grief. And he had written about wanting someone sensible, someone capable. He had not written about wanting someone beautiful, which she had appreciated more than she could say. She had not married before. There had been a man in Ohio who had asked her once, but he had been asking for the wrong reasons, and Amelia had been old enough to know the difference. She had her mother's practical streak and her father's tendency to look at a situation longer than most people were comfortable with before she committed to anything. 8 months of letters, and she had committed. She stood on the platform in Silver Creek, and she looked for Victor Hale. She spotted him quickly enough. He was standing near the far end of the platform, about 30 feet away, and he was not moving toward her. He was tall, well-dressed in a dark coat, and his hat was newer than she'd expected from a working rancher. He was looking at her, yes, but not the way a man looks at someone he has been waiting for. It was a different kind of looking, the kind where you are deciding something. Amelia walked toward him. "Mr. Hale," she extended her hand. "I'm Amelia Whitmore. It's good to finally—" "Miss Whitmore." He took her hand briefly and let it go. "I need to speak with you directly." The words were already wrong. Directly was the kind of word people used when they were about to say something they didn't want to say slowly. She kept her face still. "Of course." He cleared his throat. The crowd, she noticed, had shifted without appearing to shift. People were paying attention now in that particular way of a town with not enough drama and too much proximity. She could feel it without looking. "I've given this considerable thought," Victor said, "and I believe it wouldn't be fair, to either of us, to proceed with the arrangement." She heard the words. She processed them. She did not immediately respond. "I've met someone," he continued. "Someone here in Silver Creek. It happened after I sent my last letter, and I recognize the timing is—" "Poor," Amelia said. He blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "The timing is poor." Her voice came out steadier than she felt, which was the one thing working in her favor. "You've brought me 3,000 miles to tell me you've changed your mind." "I'd have written," But I wasn't certain until I was already on the train. She looked at him fully, with the kind of patience that isn't soft at all. Or until I was standing here. Victor Hale had the decency to look uncomfortable, which was the most she was going to get from him. He was not a cruel man. She understood that in an instant. He was simply a man who had decided that his own convenience mattered more than her dignity and had arranged the facts to make that feel like honesty. "I will, of course, cover your return fare," he said. "You'll have enough to get back to Ohio." "I don't want your money, Mr. Hale." "I insist. I said I don't want it." She picked up her bag, which she had set down briefly at her feet. Her hand was not quite steady, but she kept it pressed against her side so the trembling didn't show. "I appreciate your candor." She turned away from him. The platform was not a large space, and the crowd had done nothing so obvious as to gather in a circle, but the effect was the same. 20 or 30 faces, all of them angled toward her, all of them doing the particular arithmetic of frontier gossip, measuring her against what they'd expected, calculating what version of this story they'd tell later. A woman near the station door whispered something to the woman beside her. Amelia didn't try to hear it. She had a fair guess at its content. She walked to the far end of the platform and sat down on the wooden bench there, set her bag on her knees, and looked out at the street. Her eyes were dry. She was not going to cry here, in front of people who would remember it for 20 years. Whatever she felt about this, and she felt quite a bit, it was hers to keep until she was somewhere private. Silver Creek spread out before her in the afternoon light. It was a real town, not a cluster of tents and wishful thinking. There were several stone buildings along the main street, a hotel, what appeared to be a bank, a general store with a painted sign. The mountains in the distance were enormous and indifferent. The sky was exactly the blue Victor had described in his letters. She had absolutely no idea what she was going to do. She had $73 and some change in her coat pocket. She knew nobody in Wyoming. She had given up the position she'd held for 3 years in Ohio, administrative work for a land surveying office, which had paid her modestly and provided her a small room above the office. She had given it all up, methodically and without complaint, because she had decided to trust 41 letters and the image of a life she'd constructed from them. Amelia was not by nature a woman who wasted time on regret, but she allowed herself 30 seconds of it, sitting on that bench in the thin September sun, and then she began trying to think practically. There would be a hotel. She had enough money for a week, perhaps 2 if she was careful. She could inquire about work. There was always work of some kind in a growing town. She would figure out the next piece after she figured out this piece. That was how problems got solved, one piece at a time. She became aware that someone had stopped near her. She looked up. The man standing a few feet away was not someone she immediately placed in any category she knew. He was tall, taller than Victor, broader in the shoulders, with a face that had spent considerable time outdoors and showed it. His coat was plain but well made, his hat dark with road dust. He was perhaps 35, perhaps older. He had the kind of stillness that suggested he was used to having space around him. He was looking at her without pity, which she noticed because pity was what everyone else on that platform was offering. "You came a long way," he said. It was not a question. "Ohio," she said. He nodded slowly. Ethan Blackwood. He did not extend his hand immediately, gave her the choice of whether to respond to that. Amelia Whitmore. He looked past her briefly, in the direction Victor Hale had gone, then back. "You know anyone in Silver Creek?" "No." "Any plans?" "Working on them." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, not quite respect, but somewhere between the two. He pulled his hat off briefly, turned it in his hands, settled it back. "There's a decent hotel on the second block. Mrs. Carver runs it. She's fair." He reached into his coat and produced a card, plain with his name and a property address. "If you find yourself needing something, send word. I'll see what I can do." Amelia looked at the card, then at him. Why? The question seemed to catch him slightly off guard. Most people, she guessed, didn't ask him why. "Because," he said, after a moment, "you came 3,000 miles, and Victor Hale is an idiot." She looked at him for a long beat. Then she took the card. Mrs. Carver's hotel was $3 a week, which was less than Amelia had feared. The room was small and clean, a narrow bed, a washstand, a single window looking out over the side alley. It smelled of lye soap and dust, which was familiar enough. Amelia set her bag on the bed, sat down beside it, and let herself have 5 minutes of honest feeling before she washed her face and went downstairs to ask about work. Mrs. Carver was a small, sharp-eyed woman in her late 50s who seemed to have formed an opinion about every person in Silver Creek and kept those opinions filed away for immediate reference. She looked at Amelia the way you look at something you're deciding whether to trust. "You're the Hale woman," she said. "I'm Amelia Whitmore," Amelia said. "I understand there may be some confusion about those two things." Mrs. Carver studied her. "You're not going back east?" "Not immediately, no." "Good." She said it without explaining why, which Amelia found oddly encouraging. "I don't suppose you can cook." "I can cook adequately. I keep accounts better. I've got 3 boarders with outstanding balances who'd apparently rather die than pay on time." Mrs. Carver wiped her hands on her apron. "I've been meaning to write them proper collection notices for 2 months." "I could do that," Amelia said, "in exchange for a reduced rate on the room, if that works for you." Mrs. Carver looked at her for another moment, reassessing something. "Victor Hale is a fool," she said. "So I'm hearing," Amelia said. She had been in Silver Creek 4 days when she encountered Ethan Blackwood again. She was coming out of the general store with a small package, thread, a bar of good soap, and a notebook she'd bought for tracking her finances, when she nearly walked into him on the front step. He stepped back automatically to avoid the collision, and they both spent a moment recalibrating. "Miss Whitmore?" He looked mildly surprised. "You're still here." "I said I was working on a plan." "I see that." He held the door for an elderly man coming out behind her, then fell into step beside her, which she hadn't quite expected. "How's Mrs. Carver treating you?" "She's practical. I like practical." "She's the most practical woman in 3 counties." A brief pause. "She's also been telling half the town that Victor Hale ought to be embarrassed of himself." Amelia exhaled through her nose. "I don't need fighting done on my behalf by someone I've known 4 days." "She'd do it regardless," Ethan said. "Mrs. Carver has strong feelings about what constitutes decent behavior." They had reached the corner. He stopped and she stopped with him, not quite sure why. The street was busy with midday traffic. Wagons, horses, a pair of women she didn't know who glanced at her with that particular calibrated look she'd already learned to identify. "I have a proposition," Ethan said. He said it straightforwardly, without preamble, which she appreciated. "Not," he paused, seeming to choose words with some care. "Not what you might think. I have a ranch about 6 miles out. My housekeeper left in August. My operation manager quit the same week. I've been trying to run both sides of the thing myself since then, which is unsustainable." She watched him. "You're offering me work. I'm offering you a position. Room, board, and a fair salary. The work involves managing the household accounts, organizing the supply side, and generally keeping the domestic half of the operation from collapsing." He looked at her directly. "You'd have your own room. You'd be staff, not a dependent. If you decide in a week it's not workable, you leave with a week's pay." "You know nothing about me," Amelia said, "professionally speaking. I know you walked away from a man offering you money, and you didn't cry on a public platform." He shrugged slightly. "That's a reasonable starting point." She should have asked for time to consider. That was the sensible thing to do. But she had $70 left in a room she was paying for by writing debt collection letters, and the man standing in front of her had eyes that were direct without being unkind. "I'd want to see the books before I agree to anything," she said. Something in his expression shifted. Surprise, she thought, with maybe a trace of approval underneath it. "Fair. And if the books are a disaster, I'll tell you so." "I'd expect nothing less." The Blackwood Ranch sat in a wide, shallow valley about 6 miles east of Silver Creek, and when Amelia saw it for the first time, she understood immediately why Ethan Blackwood carried himself the way he did. It was not ostentatious. There were no unnecessary ornaments, no features put there purely to impress, but it was enormous in the honest way of something that had been built by sustained effort over many years. The main house was 2 stories, timber-framed, with a wide porch that ran the full length of the front. Beyond it stretched outbuildings, corrals, a barn that could have housed 50 horses, and pasture that rolled away to the tree line in the distance. She had grown up around farming. Her father had worked a modest operation in Ohio for 20 years before the market turned on him, and she had spent enough of her childhood helping with accounts and logistics to understand what functional looked like versus what struggling looked like. Blackwood's operation, from first glance, looked functional, more than functional. "It's larger than I pictured," she said. "It's largest cattle spread in the valley," Ethan said. He said it simply, not as a boast. 12,000 acres, give or take, 60 head of working horses, 140 ranch hands through peak season, 20 in winter. He took her inside. The house was not what she expected. She had expected the spare, dusty interior of a working man's home. Functional furniture, practical everything, nothing extra. Instead, the front rooms were furnished well, with the kind of pieces that suggested someone had cared about this place once. A large braided rug in the parlor. Curtains on the windows, though they needed washing. A sideboard with a row of books on it, which she noticed immediately. But there was something missing in it, too. She couldn't name it exactly just then. The quality of a house where people were present without quite being here. A boy appeared at the top of the stairs and stopped. He was perhaps 13, lean and dark-haired like his father, with a guarded expression that Amelia had seen before on young people who had learned that new arrivals generally meant disruption. "James," Ethan said, "come down." The boy came down slowly, one hand on the railing, watching Amelia with an assessment that was not quite hostile but was not far from it. "James, this is Miss Whitmore. She'll be managing the household accounts and the supply side." "We've had housekeepers before," James said. He looked at Amelia. "They don't stay." "James?" "I'm just telling her." The boy's voice was flat, not impolite, just stating a fact as he understood it. "Miss Harmon stayed 2 months. Mrs. Pratt stayed 6 weeks. The one before that—" "I appreciate the history," Amelia said. James looked at her, slightly thrown by her tone, not offended, just steady. "I'll keep it in mind." A smaller figure appeared in the hallway behind James, a girl of about 8, with her father's dark eyes and a cautious, searching expression. She stayed in the doorway, watching. "This is Lily," Ethan said. The girl looked at Amelia for a long moment without saying anything. Then she said, "Your bag is crooked." Amelia looked down. The strap on her bag had twisted at the shoulder. "So it is," she said. "Thank you." Lily watched her for another second, then disappeared back down the hallway. The books were, as she'd suspected, not a disaster, but they were not good either. She spent the first evening at the desk in the small office off the main hall, working through 3 months of supply ledgers while the house settled into its nighttime sounds around her. Ethan came in at one point with a cup of coffee, set it on the desk without asking if she wanted it, which she did, and stood in the doorway for a moment. "Well," he said, "your supply costs are 20% higher than they need to be. You're ordering through 2 different merchants, both of them charging you separately for hauling, which means you're paying for the same service twice." She turned a page. "Your grain contracts are structured wrong. You're locked into pricing from 8 months ago, which made sense then, but doesn't now." She looked up. "How long since anyone looked at these properly?" "Since my wife died," he said. His voice was matter-of-fact. "She handled the accounts. I handled cattle." Amelia nodded. She didn't offer condolences. He hadn't said it to earn them. He'd said it to explain a gap. "I can fix this," she said. "It'll take 2 or 3 weeks to renegotiate some of the contracts, but I can cut your operating costs significantly." He looked at the ledger, then at her. "All right. I'll need to write several letters and make 1 or 2 trips into Silver Creek to speak with the merchants directly. Use the buggy whenever you need it." She went back to the page. He stayed in the doorway a moment longer, with the particular quality of someone who has something else to say, but isn't certain yet whether to say it. Then he left. The first weeks were work, almost entirely. Amelia woke early, before the ranch was fully awake, and spent the first hour with the accounts before the day's complications arrived. She renegotiated the supply contracts with a directness that surprised both merchants. She had done her research, she knew what the fair rate was, and she said so without apology. She reorganized the kitchen supply rotation so food wasn't sitting past its usefulness. She rewrote the household inventory system, which had been kept in 3 different notebooks in 3 different places for reasons nobody could fully explain. James watched all of this from a careful distance. He was not obstructionist, but he was not warm either. He had the particular watchfulness of a child who had learned not to get attached to anything that might leave. Lily was different. Lily showed up. It started small, so... The girl appeared one morning while Amelia was working at the desk and sat in the corner with a book, not asking for anything, just being present. The next day she appeared again. On the 3rd day she brought her sewing project, which was a small quilt square that had gone sideways at one corner. "I can't get it straight," Lily said. She set it on the desk in front of Amelia. "Mama was teaching me, but she..." She stopped. Amelia looked at the quilt square. Then she set down her pen. "Let me see." She showed Lily the trick for keeping the corner true. You pinned from the center out, not the edge in, which was counterintuitive but worked. Lily sat beside her and practiced the motion with her small, careful hands, her tongue pressed against her teeth in concentration. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. Afterward, Lily went back to the corner with her sewing, and Amelia went back to the accounts. And there was something easy about the silence that Amelia hadn't felt in a long time. She did not allow herself to read too much into it. She had come here to work. That was the arrangement. But the house was changing, even so, in the small ways that houses change when someone is actually paying attention to them. Clean curtains, a meal that came out at a proper time, a vase of dried grass and seed heads on the dining table, because there was nothing flowering anymore, but the shape of the thing was still something. Small alterations, accumulated. Ethan noticed them without commenting on them, which she understood as his form of acknowledgement. One evening after supper, 3 weeks in, maybe 4, the exact days blurring slightly in the rhythm of work, she found him on the porch after the children had gone up, leaning on the rail, looking out at the dark outline of the hills. She came out to check the temperature, thinking about whether the morning would bring the first frost, and almost went back inside immediately. But he half turned at the sound of the door, and she had already crossed the threshold, so she stayed. "Cold coming," he said. "I think so." She stood at the other end of the porch railing. The sky was enormous out here in a way Ohio's sky had never been. More stars than she could count, more black between them. "I'll make sure the kitchen stores are adjusted for it." A pause. "James ate 2 helpings of dinner," Ethan said. "He hasn't done that in a while." Amelia didn't say anything. "I noticed," he said. That was all. But she understood what he meant by it. She had been careful not to try too hard with James. Trying too hard was the thing children clocked immediately, and it made them withdraw further. So she'd left doors open and not knocked on them. She'd asked him once, only once, if he knew where the older supply ledgers were kept, and he had, and he'd told her, and that had been a transaction between 2 people who were both capable and practical, which was something he could accept. She looked out at the hills. "I wasn't expecting any of this," she said. She wasn't sure why she said it. It came out unprompted, which was not her usual style. "When the train stopped, I thought I was looking at the worst day I'd had in a long time." "Was it?" She considered that honestly. "In some ways, yes." Ethan was quiet for a moment, then, "Victor Hale is not a bad man. He's just not a particularly..." He paused. "He sees what he expects to see. Most people do." "What do you see?" she asked. She said it before she'd fully decided to say it, which was unlike her. He looked at her across the length of the porch. In the dark, his face was harder to read than usual. "Someone who came 3,000 miles and sat down on a platform bench and started working out what to do next," he said, "instead of falling apart." Amelia looked back at the stars. "I almost fell apart," she said. "I know," he said. "You just didn't do it in public." She stayed on the porch for another few minutes before the cold drove her inside, and she did not examine what the conversation had meant. There was work tomorrow, and accounts to finish, and frost preparations to make, and she was not a woman who built structures in her mind from materials that hadn't been offered yet. But she slept better that night than she had since Ohio. The trouble started on a Wednesday in late October, which was, In Amelia's experience, the kind of specific detail that only matters in retrospect. She had gone into Silver Creek to finalize the last of the supply renegotiations, and she'd stopped at the general store after to pick up a few household items. The woman behind her in the queue was someone she'd seen at church but not spoken to, a tall, sharp-jawed woman named Frances Eldridge, who was married to one of the town's more prominent merchants and who had the kind of social position that she worked at maintaining. "Miss Whitmore," Frances said, in the tone of someone who had been waiting for the opportunity. "I understand you're staying out at the Blackwood Ranch." "That's right." Amelia kept her attention on the counter. "Quite a situation." Frances let the word situation carry as much freight as she could load onto it. "For a woman who arrived here to marry Victor Hale." "I arrived here to take a position I'd been offered," Amelia said. She turned to face the woman because looking away would read as shame, and she had nothing to be ashamed of. "Mr. Hale and I were briefly under a mutual misunderstanding. We've since clarified it." "I'm sure you have." Frances smiled with her mouth. "Still, it must be. Convenient. Ethan Blackwood is the wealthiest man in the valley." The store had gone quiet in the particular way of a room where everyone is pretending not to listen. "Mrs. Eldridge," Amelia said, "if you have a specific concern, I'd encourage you to say it plainly." Frances did not say it plainly. She said something vague about appearances and propriety and what people would think, which was the conversational equivalent of throwing smoke and walking away from it. Amelia bought her items and left without responding further. But she walked back to the buggy with the knowledge that this had begun, whatever this was going to be. The version of her that Silver Creek was constructing, the woman who had failed at her original purpose and latched onto a more profitable alternative, the opportunist. The schemer dressed as a practical woman. She drove the 6 miles back to the ranch and did not mention it to Ethan. She was not his problem to solve. But she thought about what Frances Eldridge's face had looked like, and she thought about James's voice on that first day. They don't stay. And she thought about Lily's small, careful hands working at the quilt corner. And she thought about the fact that she was already thinking of this place as something other than temporary, which was something she was going to have to be careful about. Amelia Whitmore had survived worse than a small-town suspicion. She had survived being left alone on a platform in front of strangers. She had survived the trip across the country on a budget that didn't have room for mistakes. She had figured out the supply contracts and the ledgers and the frost preparations and 2 small children's varying ways of needing things. She could figure out this, too. She pulled the buggy into the yard, unhitched the horse, and went inside to start supper. And she did not let herself think too much about the fact that when she walked through the door, the house felt different than it had when she'd left that morning. It felt like returning somewhere. She pressed that thought down flat and put it away and went to check on the potatoes, because there was always something practical to attend to, and practical was how she was going to get through this. Whatever this turned out to be. The frost came on a Thursday, 3 days after Amelia's encounter with Frances Eldridge in the general store, and it was heavier than anyone had expected. She was up before dawn to check the kitchen stores she'd reorganized the week prior. The root vegetables needed to come in from the outer cellar before the ground hardened further, and the water lines on the east side of the house had a weakness she'd noticed in the pipe fitting that would cause trouble if the temperature dropped another 10 degrees. She had mentioned it to Ethan 2 days ago, and he'd said he'd have one of the hands look at it, and she had no way of knowing if that had happened yet. She pulled on her coat in the dark hallway and went out. The yard was silver white in the pre-dawn, every surface edged with frost that caught the faint light from the barn where someone was already moving. Her breath came out in visible puffs. She crossed to the outer cellar, lifted the door, and began hauling up the crates she'd already organized for exactly this, moving efficiently and without ceremony. She was on the 3rd crate when she heard boots on the frozen ground behind her. "I would have sent someone for that," Ethan said. "I'm already here." She handed him the crate without asking whether he wanted it, and he took it automatically. "The pipe on the east side. Martinez fixed it yesterday afternoon." "Good." She went back down for the next crate. "The chickens need to be moved into the lower barn today. The temperature is going to drop again tonight." "I know." A pause. "How do you know?" She came back up with the last crate. "The way the clouds were sitting yesterday evening, My father used to say the clouds sit lower before a hard freeze. She picked up her crate. He was right about most practical things, even when he was wrong about other things. Ethan carried his crate toward the house. She carried hers beside him, and neither of them spoke for a moment. And it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who were both awake early and cold and doing work that needed doing. What was he wrong about? Ethan asked. She hadn't expected him to follow that thread. He thought if you worked hard enough and were decent enough, the land would give back what you put in. She pushed the kitchen door open with her shoulder. It doesn't always. The land doesn't notice how decent you are. She set the crate down and began sorting the vegetables. Ethan set his crate beside hers and didn't leave immediately. She could feel him standing there, processing something, and she gave him the time for it. Margaret, my wife, she said something like that once, he said. She said the land doesn't care, but people can. Amelia kept her hands busy with the sorting. She sounds like she was smart. She was. A pause that lasted several seconds. She was also stubborn as hell, and she hated the cold, which made winters difficult. He said it without weight, not grief performing itself for an audience, just something remembered. She'd have been in bed until 9 if she could manage it. Amelia glanced at him sideways. The corner of his mouth had moved, very slightly. I'm sorry you lost her, Amelia said. She said it plainly, without decoration, because he deserved the plain version. Yeah. He picked up his hat from the kitchen table where he'd set it. The kids miss her different ways. James holds on to things. Lily asks questions. I know, Amelia said. She asked me last week what happens to a person's face when they've been gone a long time, whether you forget what they look like. Ethan went still for half a second. What did you tell her? He asked. I told her that people's faces stay in your memory differently than other things, not like a picture, more like a feeling of a face, and that the feeling doesn't go away even when the details blur. She paused. I don't know if that was the right answer. I was guessing. He looked at her for a moment. No, he said. That was right. He left to start his day, and Amelia turned back to the vegetables, and she told herself, firmly, practically, in the voice she used for accounts and supply contracts, that she was not going to build anything from that exchange. She was going to put it in the same place she'd put the conversation on the porch, in the same place she'd put the way Lily had started sitting with her in the evenings without asking permission. She was going to be careful. November settled over the valley like a hand pressing down, and the ranch went into its winter rhythm, slower in some ways, more concentrated in others. The big cattle drives were done. The hands who left for the season had left. What remained was a core group of about 20 men, the Blackwood family, and Amelia, all of them drawn closer together by the cold and the reduced scale of things. She found her days filling in ways she hadn't anticipated. The accounts took her mornings, and she had by now reduced the ranch's supply costs by nearly 18%, a figure she'd shown Ethan without ceremony by simply setting the comparison on the desk in front of him. He had looked at it for a long moment, then looked at her, and said nothing, which she'd come to understand was his version of being impressed. The afternoons were less defined. The household ran, and she made sure it ran, and somewhere in the business of that she found herself teaching Lily to properly mend a hem, listening to James explain, in the guarded, oblique way he had, the difference between various grades of stock cattle, and writing 3 letters on behalf of the ranch to suppliers in Cheyenne that required a level of precision and persuasion she found genuinely satisfying. She also found herself in the barn more than she'd expected. She had grown up around horses and she'd missed them, and Blackwood's barn held some of the finest working stock she'd seen. There was a gray mare named Biscuit, a name that was completely at odds with the animal's personality, which was imperial and occasionally vindictive, that had taken an inexplicable interest in Amelia after she'd offered the horse a carrot without trying to make anything of it. She was grooming Biscuit one afternoon when James appeared in the barn doorway, stopped when he saw her, and looked like he was calculating whether to leave. You don't have to go, she said. She kept working. I'm almost done. He came in slowly and went to the stall of his own horse, a bay gelding he called Ranger, which was considerably more affectionate toward its rider than Biscuit was toward anyone. He started checking the gelding's hooves, which didn't strictly need doing, and Amelia continued with Biscuit, and they worked in parallel silence for a while. "She threw Mrs. Pratt," James said eventually. Amelia looked up. "Biscuit, the housekeeper before you. She tried to ride her and Biscuit threw her in the first paddock." He wasn't smiling exactly, but there was something in his voice. Mrs. Pratt cried. "She left the following week." "I wasn't planning to ride her," Amelia said. "She'd hate it if I tried." "She hates almost everyone." "I know. That's why she's interesting." James looked at her across the barn. Something shifted in his expression. Not a thaw exactly, but a small reduction of distance. "Miss Harmon was afraid of her," he said. "She wouldn't even come into this section of the barn." "Fear makes horses nervous," Amelia said. "It's a bad arrangement." "That's what Dad says." "He's right about that one." James went back to the gelding's hooves. Amelia finished with Biscuit's coat. Outside, the wind was building, pushing through the gaps in the barn siding with a sound like a low note held too long. "My mother used to groom the horses," James said. He said it to the gelding's hoof, not to Amelia. "On Sundays, mostly. She said it was the only time Dad's operation gave her any peace." Amelia took that carefully. What did she mean by that? She meant he was always thinking about cattle and land, and when she was in here, it was just horses. A pause. "She taught me how to check the frogs properly." He meant the V-shaped structures on the underside of a hoof. "Most of the ranch hands don't bother, but if you don't check them, you miss things." "I know," Amelia said. "My father was the same." James finally looked at her directly. One of the first times he'd done it without the guarded layer. "You grew up on a farm?" "Smaller than this. Ohio. We had cattle and some crops. Not..." She gestured at the scale of the barn around them. "Nothing like this, but enough that I know what I'm looking at when I see it." He nodded. He set the hoof down and moved to the next one, and Amelia put the brush away and fastened Biscuit's stall. And when she left the barn 10 minutes later, James was still working at his horse with the careful attention of someone who had been taught to do a thing correctly and took that seriously. She did not tell Ethan about the conversation. It wasn't hers to report. The talk in town intensified in November, which she had half expected. She heard about it mostly through Mrs. Carver, who had taken to sending her notes with the supply wagon that came out weekly. Brief, pointed summaries of the current social weather written in Mrs. Carver's cramped, precise hand. "Frances Eldridge has been busy. Says you've made yourself indispensable in ways that go beyond accounting. You know what she means by that, and so do I. Hold your head up." There were variations. That Amelia had engineered the whole situation, beginning with appearing helpless on the train platform to attract Ethan's attention. That she had ambitions toward the ranch itself, not just employment on it. That a woman who arrived under those circumstances could not be trusted with a widower's household and children. The cruelest version, the one that Mrs. Carver reported most reluctantly, was that Ethan Blackwood was a man who could be manipulated by a woman who knew how to appear competent, and that Amelia had understood that from the beginning. She read these notes in her room at the end of the day and felt them in the way you feel something cold placed against your skin. Not surprise, just the particular discomfort of being written as a character in someone else's story, a character with motives you don't recognize. She had not lied to anyone. She had not angled for anything. She had done the work she was hired to do, done it well, and if that had grown into something more complicated over weeks of proximity and shared mornings and a child sitting beside her with a crooked quilt square, that was not manipulation. That was just life doing what life does when you let it. She wrote back to Mrs. Carver. "Thank you for telling me. I'll manage." She was not sure she should tell Ethan. It felt like involving him in something that ought to stay at her own level. But Silver Creek was small, and he would hear eventually, and she thought it was probably better that he hear it from her. She chose a Sunday evening, when the children had gone up and the house was quiet. He was in the study working on something. He often worked in the evenings, which she'd stopped thinking of as avoidance and started recognizing as simply how he was wired, and she knocked on the open door. "Do you have a few minutes?" He looked up. "Sit down." She sat in the chair across the desk. She told him plainly what she'd heard, using Mrs. Carver's notes as reference but not reading from them, because she'd memorized enough. She watched his face while she talked. He listened the way he always listened, which was completely, without interrupting. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair. Francis Eldridge, he said, has opinions about everything and evidence for almost none of them. The opinion is spreading, Amelia said. I thought you should know. I appreciate that. He tapped the end of his pen against the desk once, twice. Does it change anything for you, your plans to stay? The question was asked with careful neutrality. She could see him trying to leave the door open in both directions. Not yet, she said, but I want to know if it changes anything for you. He looked at her for a moment. Why would it? Because it's your reputation they're working on too, and your children. My reputation has survived worse than Francis Eldridge's opinions. He set the pen down. And my children. He stopped, restarted. Lily asked me this week whether you were going to stay or leave like the others. Amelia said nothing. I told her I didn't know, he said, which is the honest answer. But I also told her that you were different from the others, which, he paused again, that is also the honest answer. The fire in the study hearth was burning low, throwing uneven light across the room. Amelia sat with that statement and did not immediately respond because she needed a moment to decide what to do with it, and she was not a woman who filled silences with words when she didn't have the right ones yet. Different how? She finally asked. He looked at her steadily. You're not here because you have nowhere else to go, he said. Not anymore. You've had offers. Mrs. Hendricks at the bank mentioned it to me last week, said she'd approached you about a bookkeeping position. Amelia hadn't known he'd heard about that. She did. You turned her down. The accounts here aren't finished yet. The accounts have been finished for 6 weeks, Ethan said, in the sense that they're functioning and the savings are in place. You could hand off what you know to someone else. She looked at him across the desk. Why are you still here? He asked. He said it without pressure, genuinely asking. Amelia took a breath. Because it's not done, she said, and I don't leave things half done. She paused. And Lily is working on the 3rd row of her quilt and she'll have questions. Something moved across Ethan's face that she couldn't fully classify. He picked up the pen again, looked at it, set it back down. All right, he said. She stood. I'll let you finish. Amelia. She stopped in the doorway. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the desk. The talk in town. I'll deal with it. You don't need to. I know I don't need to. He finally looked up. I'm going to anyway. She went back to her room and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a while, not ready to sleep yet, thinking about the way he'd said her name. Not Miss Whitmore, just Amelia, which was the first time and which she had noticed, despite herself, the way you notice a door opening that has been closed for a long time. Ethan Blackwood was not a man who made noise when he did things. She learned this about him in pieces. He didn't announce his plans, and he didn't ask for acknowledgement, and he didn't explain himself after the fact unless someone asked directly. He simply moved, made decisions, produced results, and moved on to the next thing. So when she went into Silver Creek the following Wednesday and found that something had shifted, subtly, in the way towns shift when a powerful man has said something quietly to the right people, she should not have been surprised. Francis Eldridge was not at the general store that day. The woman who ran the milliners, who had previously offered Amelia a tight, evaluating smile, said good morning first. At the bank, the teller, who had twice made a comment about Amelia's unusual situation, was straightforward and efficient and said nothing personal at all. She didn't ask Ethan about it when she got back. She understood it had happened, and she understood what it cost him in terms of social capital, the invisible currency of a man like Ethan Blackwood. And she did not want to make it more complicated by making it a conversation. But she thought about it. She thought about it more than was strictly useful. December arrived, and with it, the first real test of the winter. A snowstorm came in from the northwest on a Tuesday night. Not the worst storm the territory had seen, but significant, the kind that piled up fast and shut everything down for 2 days. Amelia had prepared for it as best she could, the way she'd been preparing for every practical contingency since she arrived. Extra stores laid in, lanterns checked, the horses moved, firewood stacked against both sides of the house. What she had not prepared for was Lily developing a fever on the second day of the storm. It came on fast, the way fevers do in children, fine in the morning, burning by afternoon. Amelia found her when she went to bring her lunch, and the girl's skin was hot, and her eyes had the particular bright, unfocused look that meant the fever was already high. She sent one of the hands for the doctor in Silver Creek, knowing he might not make it through the snow until tomorrow, and she set about managing what was in front of her. Cool cloths. Water, insistently offered. The girl's temperature monitored by touch every half hour because that was what she had and what she knew. She had some willow bark in the kitchen stores. She'd included it when she reorganized the medicine supplies 2 months ago, which Ethan had noted with mild curiosity at the time. And she made a tea from it and got most of it into Lily by degrees. Ethan stayed. Of course he stayed. He was not a man who went elsewhere when something was wrong in his house, but he also didn't hover or get in the way, which she appreciated. He checked in every hour, standing in the doorway of Lily's room with his hat in his hands and the particular helpless tension of a parent who is not able to fix the thing that needs fixing. "She's not worse," Amelia told him the third time he appeared. "The tea is helping. Her temperature has come down a little." "You're sure?" "I'm not sure of anything, but her color is better than it was 2 hours ago and she stopped shivering." He stood in the doorway. "I should be doing this," he said. It came out rough, without his usual even quality. "You are doing this," Amelia said. "You're the one who taught her to check the horse's hooves. You're the one who stayed every night after Margaret died when James had nightmares. She knows you're here." She looked at him. "She knows." He leaned one shoulder against the doorframe and let out a slow breath. He looked, in that moment, less like the wealthiest rancher in the valley and more like a man who was very tired and had been for some time. "Margaret used to say I was good at the big things and terrible at the small ones," he said. "This is a small thing turning into a big thing," Amelia said. "You're doing fine." He looked at Lily, who had finally fallen into a proper sleep rather than the fitful doze of the past few hours. "She'll be all right?" "She'll be all right." He pushed off the doorframe and left, and Amelia stayed in the chair beside the bed, with her hand resting near Lily's, near enough to feel if the fever spiked again. The doctor arrived the following morning through a gap in the storm and confirmed what Amelia had already concluded: a respiratory fever, likely to break within another day. No complications visible. He looked at the willow bark tea, asked who had made it, and said it was the right call. He was gone within the hour. Lily woke up that afternoon asking for crackers and wanting to show Amelia how far she'd gotten on the 4th row of the quilt. James came into the room with the crackers and stood by the bed, and the expression on his face when he saw his sister sitting up and talking was something Amelia looked away from because it was too private. She made herself busy with the cloth on the washstand, giving him the moment. Later, in the kitchen, James appeared while she was cleaning up. "Thank you," he said. He said it stiffly, like the words were unfamiliar in his mouth in this context, but he said them. "She did most of the work," Amelia said. "Lily's stubborn." "She gets that from Dad." "Probably." He picked up the empty tray she'd been about to carry to the sink and carried it himself, which was, without fanfare, without comment, the clearest thing he'd said to her in 2 months. The storm cleared on Thursday, and the valley came back to life with the particular relief of a place that has held its breath for 2 days. The sky went flat and brilliant, the snow so bright in the afternoon sun that it was almost painful to look at. Amelia stood on the porch in the cold just for a few minutes, letting herself feel the relief of a problem resolved. She heard the door behind her, and then Ethan was standing beside her with 2 cups of coffee, and he handed her one, and they looked out at the snow together. "Lily wants to go outside tomorrow," he said. "She can if the temperature holds. She should keep her coat done up." "She'll argue about the coat." "I know. She'll do it anyway." Amelia wrapped both hands around the cup. "James carried the tray yesterday." "I heard." He drank his coffee. "He's coming around." "He's been coming around for a while," Amelia said. "He's just careful about how he shows it." Ethan was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that had something in it. "I have to go into Silver Creek Friday," he said. "Business at the bank. I'll be back by evening." A pause. "If you needed anything from town, I'll make a list," she said. "Amelia." He said her name the same way he had in the study. Just her name, no title, and it carried something in it that she was running out of places to set down. "I'm glad you're here." She looked at the snow. She thought about the platform in September, the bench, the bag with the bent brass clasp, The 30 seconds she had allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had gone wrong. She thought about $73 and no plan, and a man who had not looked at her with pity. "So am I," she said. The coffee was warm in her hands. The valley stretched away from them, white and enormous and indifferent, the way land always is, not noticing, not caring. But the porch was warm from the house behind them, and somewhere inside, Lily Blackwood was working on the fourth row of her quilt, and James had carried a tray without being asked, and these were the kinds of things, small and specific and real, that Amelia Whitmore had always understood were the actual substance of a life. She finished her coffee and went inside because there was still supper to start, and accounts to review before Friday, and she was, as she had always been, a practical woman. But she carried what he'd said with her through the rest of that afternoon, turned it over in her hands the way you turn over something you haven't decided what to do with yet, and for the first time since the train pulled into Silver Creek, she let herself think, quietly, cautiously, without building too much from it, that maybe the plan she had been working on since that platform bench was no longer the same plan she'd started with. Victor Hale came back on a Friday in the second week of January, which was, as far as Amelia was concerned, the worst possible timing, not because she was unprepared for him emotionally, but because she was in the middle of reconciling the winter quarter accounts, and she hated leaving things half-finished. She didn't know he was in Silver Creek until Mrs. Carver's note arrived with the Wednesday supply wagon, 2 days after the fact. The note was shorter than usual, which, with Mrs. Carver, meant the content was more serious, not less. Victor Hale returned Monday. Came with 2 men I don't recognize, dressed like lawyers or close to it. Been asking questions around town, asking about you specifically. Thought you should know before someone else told you wrong. Amelia read the note twice, folded it, and put it in her coat pocket. Then she finished the column she was on before she let herself think about what it meant. She had not spent much time thinking about Victor Hale since October. That was not suppression. It was the natural result of having enough real and present things to pay attention to. The accounts, the children, the winter preparations, Lily's fever, the slow, careful negotiations of daily life in a house that had been half closed for 2 years before she arrived. Victor Hale had been an incident, an embarrassing, expensive, thoroughly unpleasant incident, but an incident nonetheless. She had moved past it in the way practical people move past things. Not by pretending they hadn't happened, but by making the next decision and the one after that until the incident was behind her by enough distance to lose its grip. The note suggested the incident was not as finished as she'd thought. She told Ethan that evening. She did what she'd done with the Francis Eldridge situation. She presented the information plainly, without dramatizing it, watching his face for the response. His face did less than she expected. He read the note, handed it back, and said, "What do you think he wants?" "I don't know," she said. But 2 lawyers and a week of asking questions doesn't suggest he came back to apologize. "No," Ethan said. "It doesn't." He was quiet for a moment. He still owns property in the valley, 2 parcels east of town that he's been letting sit. Could be a business trip. "Could be," Amelia said. They both knew it probably wasn't. She went to bed that night with the particular low-grade unease of something you can't see clearly but can hear moving in the dark, and she told herself what she always told herself in those circumstances. Wait until you have real information before you spend energy on imaginary problems. She had enough real work in front of her, but she slept poorly, and in the morning she was up before dawn again. And when she went to the kitchen to start the stove, she stood for a moment with her hand on the cold iron and thought, "What does he think he has on me?" Because that was the question. Victor Hale was not a stupid man. He was not impulsive. If he had come back with lawyers and a week of groundwork, he had something in mind, and something specific enough to justify the cost and the awkwardness of returning to a place where he was not, she imagined, currently very popular. She could not figure out what it was, and not being able to figure something out bothered her more than most things. He came to the ranch on a Thursday. She saw the buggy coming up the road from the front window and recognized him from the way he sat, straight-backed, deliberate, the posture of a man who has decided on a thing. There were 2 other men in the buggy with him. She had about 4 minutes before they reached the house. She went to find Ethan. He was in the barn with Martinez, looking at one of the mares that had been favoring her left foreleg. He came out when she appeared in the doorway, reading her face. "He's here," she said. He looked past her toward the road. "All right." He said it the same way he said most things, not dramatically, just as a fact to be dealt with. He pulled off his work gloves and tucked them in his belt. "Go inside." "I'm not going inside," she said. He looked at her. "He came because of me," she said. "I'm not going to stand in the kitchen while it gets handled in the yard." A pause. Something in Ethan's expression that might have been the beginning of an argument, and then wasn't. "Fine. Stay behind me." "I'll stay beside you," she said, "or I'll stand in front of you, but not behind." He exhaled once through his nose. "Amelia." "Ethan." They looked at each other for a half-second, and she watched the argument recalculate and resolve, and he said nothing more, and they walked out to the yard together. Victor's buggy came to a stop about 30 feet from the house. He stepped down first, and he looked, she thought, much the same as he had on the train platform in September. Well-dressed, carefully composed, with the particular shine of a man who has spent time and money on the impression he makes. The two men who climbed down after him were exactly what Mrs. Carver had said, lawyers, or close enough that the distinction didn't matter. Victor's gaze found her immediately, and she held it without effort. "Mr. Blackwood," he said, with a nod, "I appreciate you seeing me." "You didn't give me much choice about that," Ethan said. "Showing up unannounced." "No, I suppose not." Victor looked at Amelia again. "Miss Whitmore, you're looking well." "Mr. Hale," she said. Nothing else. He cleared his throat. "I'd prefer to conduct this conversation indoors, if that's acceptable. There are documents to review." "We'll conduct it here," Ethan said. "Say what you came to say." A flicker of irritation crossed Victor's face, quickly suppressed. He was good at suppressing things. She'd noticed that about him in the 8 months of letters, too, in the way he'd written around the things he didn't want to say directly. The man managed information like he managed property, carefully, with an eye toward what he could leverage. "Very well," he said. He nodded to the taller of the two lawyers, who opened a leather case and produced a document, several pages, tied with a cord. "When Miss Whitmore and I entered into our arrangement, a contract was signed. A formal agreement executed with witnesses outlining the terms of our proposed union." "I'm aware of what a marriage contract is," Ethan said. "Then you'll understand that the contract contains specific provisions. One of those provisions," Victor nodded at the lawyer again, who flipped to a specific page, "concerns what happens in the event that the arrangement is not fulfilled." He looked at Amelia. "I have been advised that there are grounds to argue Miss Whitmore is in breach of that agreement." The cold was sharp in the yard. Amelia could see her own breath. She said, carefully and quietly, "The arrangement was not fulfilled because you ended it, on a public platform, in front of this entire town." "I communicated a change of circumstance," Victor said. "The contract, however, specifies a period of—" "Victor," she said his name plainly, without heat. "What is it you actually want?" He looked at her. And in that look she saw something that surprised her slightly. Not cruelty, not malice exactly, but the bruised pride of a man who had made a decision and then watched it reflect badly on him for 4 months in the town where he lived and had decided the most efficient way to fix his own image was to make her the problem. "There is a financial penalty clause," he said, "for breach, and there is a secondary clause regarding—" He paused, and the pause was too long. "Regarding the reputation and conduct of both parties during the period of the agreement." "Say it plainly," Ethan said. His voice had changed. Not louder, quieter, which was worse. Victor looked at him. "The clause allows the aggrieved party to bring a formal claim in the event that the other party's conduct during or following the agreement period creates public scandal or damages the aggrieved party's standing in the community." He folded his hands. "I believe a case could be made." The yard was very quiet. Amelia heard what he was not saying as clearly as what he was, that her presence in Ethan's household, the talk in town, all of it, Francis Eldridge's work over the past months, had handed him a constructed argument. He wasn't claiming she had wronged him. He was claiming that the appearance of her conduct had wronged him, that the whispers and the speculation and the loaded word situation had damaged his name. It was, she thought with a cold clarity, extremely clever. He had taken the damage done to her reputation and found a way to attach it to himself as injury. She started to speak. Ethan spoke first. "I'm going to ask you something," he said to Victor, and his tone was the particular even, hard tone of a man who has thought through several responses and chosen the one most likely to land. "And I want you to think carefully before you answer. What exactly do you think is going to happen here?" Victor blinked. "I'm presenting a legal. You came to my property," Ethan said, "with a contract that you broke. And yes, you broke it, Victor, because you stood on that train platform and said the words out loud in front of 40 people, and no lawyer alive is going to argue successfully otherwise. And you're suggesting that the woman you abandoned has somehow harmed you by going to work and managing herself with more dignity than you showed her." He took one step forward. Not threatening, just closing the distance between the two of them to the point where Victor had to hold his ground or step back. "So, I'll ask again. What do you think is going to happen?" Victor held his ground, but it cost him something. Amelia could see it in the set of his jaw. "You may believe the contract is unenforceable," he said. "A judge may feel differently. A judge is going to read a contract that you voided publicly and then look at a courtroom full of Silver Creek residents who watched you do it," Ethan said. "And then he's going to look at Miss Whitmore, who came 3,000 miles on the strength of your word and has spent the last 4 months working an honest position, and he is going to decide accordingly. The clause about conduct is constructed on gossip that you know the source of," Ethan said. "Frances Eldridge is not an impartial party, and she has been running that particular story since October. You know that because you and her husband have been doing business together for 3 years. He paused, letting that sit. "So this is what I think. I think you came back because 4 months of living with what you did on that platform has been uncomfortable, and you've decided the cleanest fix is to make Amelia the one who was wrong. And I think you've convinced yourself that I'm going to stand aside and let that happen because you have lawyers and a document." A beat. "I'm not." The yard held its silence. The taller lawyer murmured something to Victor. Victor didn't look at him. He was looking at Ethan with an expression that was recalibrating in real time. He had come prepared for money, for negotiation, possibly for Ethan's inconvenience, if not his outright cooperation, and he had not come prepared for this. Amelia had been standing beside Ethan and staying quiet, which was not her natural preference, but which she understood, in this specific moment, was the correct move. Ethan was not fighting on her behalf in the way Victor fought, with documents and leverage. He was fighting with his actual position, his actual standing in this territory, and the specific weight of a man who meant every word he said, but she had something to say. "Victor," she said. Both men looked at her. She stepped forward, not past Ethan, beside him, which was where she'd said she'd stand. She looked at Victor Hale directly, the same way she'd looked at him on the train platform, with the steadiness that was not performing confidence, but was simply what happened when she'd already decided she was not going to break. "I understand what you're trying to do," she said, "and I understand why. 4 months ago, you made a decision you can't undo in front of people you have to live with, and it's been sitting poorly with you." She kept her voice even. "I don't blame you for that. Being wrong in public is hard. I had some practice with it that same afternoon." He looked at her without speaking. "But here's what I need you to understand," she said. "I am not a loose end from your mistake. I am not a problem you get to tidy up because you've decided the story you started needs a different ending. I am a person who walked away from what happened and built something of my own with what I had, and you do not get to dismantle that because it makes you look better." She paused. "Take your contract and go home, Victor." The silence stretched. Victor Hale was not, as she had noted before, a cruel man. He was a prideful one, and pride was, in her experience, the more complicated problem. Cruelty was a character defect, but pride was a wound that kept re-inflicting itself, and you could not reason with a man's wound the way you could reason with his logic. But she watched something shift in him, standing in that yard. Not a defeat, not exactly. More like a man finally looking at a reflection that had been there the whole time and choosing, slowly, to see what was actually in it. "The contract," the taller lawyer began. "Enough," Victor said. The lawyer went quiet. Victor looked at Amelia for a moment longer. Then he looked at Ethan. Then he looked at the mountains beyond the ranch, which were the same as they always were. Enormous, permanent, entirely uninterested in the concerns of anyone standing beneath them. "You'll be hearing from my lawyers," he said. But it came out without the weight it had carried when he arrived. It was the statement of a man maintaining a position he'd already decided to abandon. He got back in the buggy. His lawyers got in after him, the taller one looking faintly embarrassed, which Amelia found briefly satisfying. The buggy turned and went back down the road. She and Ethan stood in the yard and watched it go. The reaction came after, hers, which she had held in the yard with both hands the way you hold a door closed against pressure on the other side. When the buggy was out of sight, she turned and walked into the barn. Not the house, because the barn was closer and she needed a moment that wasn't the kitchen or the hall where James and Lily might appear. She stood in the middle of the barn floor and let herself shake for about 30 seconds. It was not fear exactly, and it was not grief. It was the physical aftermath of sustained effort, the way your legs go strange after you've been running and you finally stop. Biscuit put her head over the stall rail and looked at her. "Don't," Amelia said. The mare snorted. "I know," Amelia said, to nobody in particular. She heard Ethan's boots on the barn floor behind her. She didn't turn around. "You all right?" he asked. "Yes." A pause. "In a minute." He didn't leave. He also didn't come closer, which was exactly right. He stopped far enough away that she had her space, close enough that she wasn't alone in it. She had noticed before that he had an instinct for exactly how much presence a situation called for, and he rarely got it wrong. "The contract," she said, when the shaking had mostly stopped. "Is he going to pursue it?" "No," Ethan said. He sounded certain enough that she believed him. "He made the trip to see what I'd do. Now he knows." "And what did he learn?" "That it's going to cost him more than it's worth." He paused. "Victor Hale doesn't do things that aren't worth the cost. It's a quality I actually respect in most circumstances." She turned around. He was leaning against one of the support beams, arms crossed, watching her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Concern, but the practical kind, directed at a problem he was already calculating. "What you said to him," he said. "The last part." "Which part?" "That you built something of your own." She looked at him. "Is that how you see it?" he asked. The question was careful, like he was setting something down gently and watching to see if it held. She thought about it honestly, which was the only way she knew how to think about things. The accounts. The curtains. Lily's quilt squares and the fourth row finished. James and the tray, coffee and the cold on the porch. The particular quality of a house where someone is paying attention. "Yes," she said. "That's how I see it." He nodded. He uncrossed his arms and pushed off the beam. "Good," he said. He picked up the work gloves he'd left on the stall rail. "Then we'd better make sure he understands that clearly." He looked at her. "I'm going to Silver Creek tomorrow. I want to speak with Harlan Price at the bank about the legal angle. Document what happened here in case Victor decides to push past today's performance. I'd like you to come with me." "As a witness?" "As the person this concerns," he said. "You should be in the room." She had been included in the management of her own situation. That was not nothing. That was in fact exactly what she'd been asking for from the moment she arrived. "All right," she said. "What time?" Harlan Price was a compact, efficient man who had been managing the Silver Creek Bank for 11 years, and who had, in Amelia's assessment, seen enough frontier disputes to lose most of his capacity for surprise. He listened to Ethan's account of the morning with his hands folded on the desk and his face professionally neutral, and he listened to Amelia's account with the same neutral attention. And when they were both finished, he sat for a moment and said, "The conduct clause is weak." "That's what I thought," Ethan said. "It's dependent on establishing that the conduct was, in fact, scandalous, and that it directly harmed his community standing. The first half is difficult to prove because the conduct in question is—" Price looked at Amelia, then back at Ethan. A woman working a legitimate position on a reputable ranch. The second half is difficult to prove because Victor's standing in this community took its hit in September on a public platform, not in the months following. He picked up his pen, made a note. I'd recommend a formal letter from this office to his legal team clarifying our position. It makes the cost-benefit clearer. Do that, Ethan said. Price looked at Amelia. Miss Whitmore, is there anything in the original contract, anything in the terms as you understood them, that you believe gives him any angle we haven't covered? She had been thinking about this since the yard. There was a financial provision, she said, a sum that was to exchange hands at the time of the marriage. I never received it because the marriage didn't occur. I wouldn't expect to. She paused. But the contract did specify the sum, which means there's a record of the financial arrangement. If his lawyers are creative, they might try to argue that the existence of the sum implies a continuing obligation of some kind. Price looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating something. She used to manage accounts for a land surveying office, Ethan said. I see that, Price said. He wrote something. We'll address the financial provision in the letter, explicitly. He looked at her again. Is there anything else? The witnesses to the original contract, she said. I only signed what was sent to me in Ohio. The witnesses would have been on his end. I'd want to know who they were. Price nodded slowly. That's a reasonable thing to know. He wrote again. I'll include a request for witness identification in the letter. If he has any trouble producing them, that tells us something. They left the bank an hour later and stood in the street for a moment, the January cold pressing down on the town, the sky the white-gray of a day that wasn't sure whether it wanted to snow. You knew about the financial provision angle, Ethan said. It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation. Give him ideas if he hadn't had them yet. He looked at her with that expression she still didn't have a precise name for. Harlan Price has been practicing banking law for 20 years, he said. You were ahead of him. He didn't know the contract terms, she said. I did. Ethan shook his head slightly. Not dismissal, more the gesture of someone who has just confirmed something they already suspected. Do you want lunch before we head back? The hotel dining room is decent. She was about to say it wasn't necessary, that they should get back to the ranch. But she was also cold and tired, and the morning had been genuinely difficult. And something about the offer, the simple, practical ordinaries of it, made her want to accept it. Yes, she said. That would be good. They ate in the hotel dining room, which was warm and mostly empty, at midday, and they talked about the ranch, the spring planning, a fence line on the east pasture that needed replacing before the ground thawed, whether to add another string of horses to the operation in the coming year. It was the kind of conversation she'd had a dozen times at the desk in his study, practical and forward-looking, but it was different sitting across from him in a public room with coffee and actual food and the sound of other people around them. It was different in a way she didn't examine directly. She noticed that two women at the far table watched them when they came in and whispered between themselves, and then, after a while, stopped watching. She noticed that the man who ran the hotel said good afternoon to Ethan, and then looked at her and said good afternoon to her also, as if she were simply someone who warranted that much, which was not nothing in Silver Creek in January. She noticed that Ethan ate his meal without self-consciousness, which was the quality of a man who was comfortable wherever he was and didn't need the room to affirm it. Victor came back because of the ranch, Ethan said toward the end of the meal. He said it like he'd been working it through and had arrived somewhere. Amelia looked at him. Not because of you specifically, he said, or not only. He has interests east of town, those two parcels. He's been trying to expand his operation, and the bank's been reluctant to extend him credit without collateral that's performing. He set down his fork. If he can establish a legal claim against my operation, against me, it creates leverage he can use elsewhere. It muddies my position with the bank and frees up some of the capital competition he's facing. She thought about it. He'd use me to get at you. He'd use the appearance of a dispute to suggest my household is unstable, my management is questionable, that there are legal entanglements. He looked at her steadily. It's not about justice. It was never about justice. I know, she said. I knew that in the yard. She paused. Does that change anything for you? What do you mean? If this is about his competition with you, she said carefully, and I'm the mechanism, does that change how you're thinking about it? He looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who needs to confirm they understood the question. You're asking if I'm defending you for my own reasons, he said. I'm asking if that's part of it, she said, because I'd rather know. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he was offended. Then he said, the two things aren't separate. You're here. The ranch is mine. Victor's using one to get at the other, and I have every reason to stop him on both counts. He met her eyes. But if it were only about the business, I'd have had a quieter conversation with his lawyers about costs and let them walk away. He paused. That's not what I did. She held that. She turned it over. She decided to accept it, which was, for her, for a woman who had spent the last 4 months being very careful not to accept things that weren't fully confirmed, a larger gesture than it probably looked. All right, she said. They rode back to the ranch in the early afternoon, the road white-edged and empty, the horses steady in the cold. At some point during the ride, Amelia realized she had not thought about Ohio in weeks, not as a place to return to, not as the origin point of everything that had gone wrong. It had simply stopped occurring to her, the way things stop occurring to you when they've been replaced by something more present. She thought about that for the length of a mile or so. Then she thought about the spring planting and the east pasture fence and whether to put the new supply contracts on a quarterly or monthly cycle going forward, and those thoughts were more manageable. But the other thing sat with her, quiet and specific, all the way back to the Blackwood house. And when she walked in through the kitchen door and Lily looked up from the table where she was doing schoolwork and said, "You're back, I finished the 5th row," Amelia said, "Let me see it," and sat down beside her and felt without performing it that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She did not say so. She was still careful. She was still, in the most fundamental sense, a practical woman, but the care was starting to feel less like protection and more like habit, and she was beginning to understand the difference. 3 days after the meeting at the bank, Mrs. Carver sent another note. This one was brief even by Mrs. Carver's standards. Victor Hale left town Tuesday morning. Heard from Aldous Price, Harlan's brother, the one who talks too much, that the legal letter went out Monday and the lawyers wrote back within the day declining to pursue. Francis Eldridge has been very quiet. Thought you'd want to know. Well done. Amelia read it at the desk in the study where she was working on the quarterly summary. She folded it. She put it in the desk drawer. She went back to the quarterly summary. Ethan appeared in the doorway 10 minutes later, looking like he'd just come in from the cold. Any news? He's gone, she said. Tuesday morning, the lawyers backed down. He nodded. Came in and poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot she'd made an hour ago. You don't seem surprised. I'm not, she said. You told me he wouldn't do things that weren't worth the cost. I did. He drank his coffee, standing near the desk, looking at the quarterly summary in front of her. How's it looking? Better than last quarter, she said. The new supply contracts are performing. We're under budget on winter feed by about 12%. 12%. I found a secondary supplier in Laramie who's willing to move volume at a better rate. I've been running a split order for 6 weeks to test their reliability. She looked up at him. They've been reliable. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the summary. Then he said, When you came in September, I thought I was hiring someone to keep the books from getting worse. That's what you hired me for, she said. That's not what I got, he said. Not as a complaint. She looked at him steadily. No, she said. It's not. He held her gaze for just long enough to make it something, and then he set down his coffee cup and said, I'll leave you to it, and went back to his day, because he was a man who did not sit in the middle of things for longer than necessary, and because there were always cattle to check and a fence line to assess and 20 people whose work needed overseeing. And Amelia turned back to the quarterly summary because there were always numbers to reconcile and decisions to support, and the next practical problem waiting right behind the one you'd just solved. But the room was warmer than it had been, and that had nothing to do with the fire. February came in hard and stayed that way. The cold that settled over the valley in the second week of the month was the kind that got into wood and stone and didn't leave, the kind that made the ranch hands work in shorter rotations and made the horses restless in the barn and made the pipes, even the ones Martinez had fixed in November, groan at night in ways that kept Amelia half awake listening for the sound that meant something had actually burst. Nothing burst, but the listening wore on her. She had been at the Blackwood Ranch for nearly 5 months, which she knew precisely because she had arrived in late September, and February's particular quality of cold and compressed light made the math feel important. 5 months was longer than either of Ethan's previous housekeepers had lasted. It was long enough that she knew where everything was kept without thinking about it. Long enough that James had stopped watching her with the door half open and started simply walking in. Long enough that Lily had finished the quilt, all 8 rows of it, the last 2 with almost no assistance, and had started a second one that she said was going to be for Amelia's room. Amelia had told her that wasn't necessary. Lily had said, "I know it's not necessary. I want to." The distinction mattered to the girl, and Amelia understood that, so she had said thank you and let it go. The shift in Silver Creek had been gradual and then, in the way of these things, suddenly obvious. The meeting at the bank, Victor's departure, the letter from Price's office. These had not been public events, but small towns run on inference, and the inference here was clear enough. Ethan Blackwood had stood behind Amelia Whitmore, and whatever legal threat Victor Hale had arrived with had dissolved within the week. That told the town something. Not everything, but enough. Francis Eldridge's particular brand of whisper campaign had not entirely stopped. Amelia was not naive enough to think it ever would, but it had shifted in character. It was less about Amelia's motives now, and more about the simple fact of her continued presence, which people were beginning to absorb as a thing that was simply true, the way you absorb a new building on a familiar street. You notice it at first, then you stop noticing it, and then one day you can't quite remember what was there before. She noticed Mrs. Reardon at the general store, who had previously managed a precise and pointed silence whenever Amelia was present. Say, "Good afternoon," and ask whether the roads out to the Blackwood place were manageable in the cold. She noticed that the Women's Auxiliary, which organized the community events, had sent a note to the ranch addressed to both Ethan Blackwood and Miss A. Whitmore about an upcoming winter social. She noticed these things and did not make too much of them and went on with her work. But the town was turning, the way weather turns, slowly and then all at once. The social was on a Saturday in mid-February, held in the long room behind the Silver Creek Church Hall, which was the largest enclosed space in town and the traditional venue for anything requiring more than 30 people. Amelia had attended 3 community events since September, 2 of them briefly and under specific practical purpose, and had been to none that were purely social. She had not particularly wanted to go to this one. "You don't have to want to," Ethan said on the Friday evening before. He was in the kitchen, which he had taken to stopping in at the end of the day with more regularity than he probably realized. "But it would be good for you to be there." "Good for who?" she asked. "For you," he said. "For the ranch. For the general position of not ceding the field to Francis Eldridge." She looked at him. "Is that how you see it? Ceding a field?" "I think certain things need to be stated plainly," he said, "and sometimes the way you state a thing is by showing up." She had thought about that for the rest of the evening and concluded he was right, which was irritating because she had been hoping he wasn't. She wore the blue dress she'd brought from Ohio. The better one, the wool, which she'd saved for what she'd imagined would be some occasion marking the new life she was making. It had not occurred to her, when she packed it, that the occasion would be a winter social in Wyoming 11 months after the plan it was meant to commemorate had dissolved on a train platform. But here she was, and the dress was warm and the color was good on her, and she was not going to be sentimental about it. Ethan looked at her when she came downstairs and said nothing, which with him meant more than most men's speeches. They went in the ranch wagon, all 4 of them. Ethan and James on the bench, Lily and Amelia in the back with 2 wool blankets, and Lily's ongoing narration of everything she planned to say to her friend Clara once they arrived. James was quieter than usual on the ride in, which Amelia had started to read as his version of nerves, though he would have denied it if asked. "You look nice," Lily told Amelia at one point. "Thank you. So do you." "I know," Lily said, with the serene confidence of an 8-year-old who has been told she looks nice enough times to have accepted it as fact. "Clara's mother is going to be there. She always talks too long." "Then we'll stand near the food," Amelia said. "That way we have an excuse to move." Lily considered this. That's smart. I have my moments. From the bench, without turning around, James made a sound that was, ambiguously but unmistakably, something close to a laugh. Oh. The long room was warm from too many people in too small a space, which was its own kind of luxury in February. Lanterns hung at intervals along the walls, throwing yellow light over tables of food and the cluster of townspeople who had turned out in their better clothes. The noise was the particular noise of a community gathering, overlapping conversations, children's voices cutting through the adult register, the scrape of chairs, someone's attempts at the fiddle from the far corner. Amelia walked in beside Ethan and felt the room rearrange itself around their arrival in that subtle, frontier town way. A few heads turning, a few conversations pausing, a few recalibrations. She had felt this before, in October, in November, and she knew what it was, and she had decided in advance that she was going to stand up straight and look at people directly and speak when spoken to and not make any of it into a performance. Harlan Price came over within minutes and shook Ethan's hand and then, pointedly, shook Amelia's. A small gesture in most contexts, significant in this one. His wife said something warm and forgettable that Amelia appreciated for the warmth and let go of immediately. The evening moved. She talked to more people than she'd expected. The doctor who had come out during Lily's fever and who wanted to know how she'd known about the willow bark. A rancher's wife named Helen Sutton, who was plain-spoken and funny, and who Amelia thought, within 10 minutes, she would like to know better. A young man who worked at the telegraph office and who seemed baffled that she knew what split supply ordering was. Frances Eldridge was there. Of course she was. Frances Eldridge was everywhere social happened in Silver Creek. She had positioned herself on the far side of the room with two other women, and she watched Amelia with the particular quality of someone who has been running a campaign and is reassessing its current state. Amelia looked at her once, nodded once, and went back to her conversation with Helen Sutton. Halfway through the evening, she was standing near the food table, which had in fact proved useful, as Lily had predicted, when she became aware that Ethan was beside her. He had been across the room talking to one of the other large landowners, a man named Carroll, whose cattle operation bordered the Blackwood Range on the south. Carroll's been asking about the supply renegotiations, he said, low enough that it was just for her. He heard we'd cut costs significantly. What did you tell him? That we had good management. A pause. He asked, who? She looked at him sidelong. And? I told him you. He said it simply, without elaboration. He wants to talk to you about his operation. She looked across the room at Carroll, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with the direct, assessing manner of someone who had built what he had through specific decisions rather than luck. He caught her looking and nodded, which she returned. All right, she said. Not tonight, Ethan said. I just wanted to tell you, so you knew. She understood what he was giving her. Not a commission, not a business arrangement, not even exactly a compliment. He was telling her that her work had its own gravity now, separate from his, that it had moved beyond the ranch and attached itself to her name in the way that competence eventually does, in places small enough that reputations have room to travel. She had come here with $73 and one bent-class bag. She had come here to be someone's wife and had ended up, by a route she could not have drawn in advance, being the person who redesigned a ranch's supply chain and managed the household of a widower and taught an 8-year-old to keep quilt corners straight and held a door closed against a legal threat until it went away. She was, it turned out, not an easy woman to define, which was something she'd known about herself for a long time, but which felt different in Wyoming in February with Ethan Blackwood standing beside her at a food table saying her name to men who mattered. Thank you, she said. For what? For telling Carroll it was me, she said. You could have said it was the operation generally. He looked at her with the particular expression she still didn't have a complete word for, the one that meant he was paying attention in a way that went past the practical. Why would I do that? He said. She didn't have an answer to that, so she picked up a piece of cornbread and ate it, and he stood beside her in a not quite comfortable, not quite uncomfortable silence that was its own kind of statement. It was James who broke something open, which surprised her, because James was the one she'd always assumed would hold out longest. It was a Sunday in late February, 2 weeks after the social. The morning had been ordinary. Accounts in the early hours, breakfast, Lily's schoolwork, the particular Sunday rhythm of the ranch that was slightly slower than the rest of the week without being still. Ethan had gone out to check the south fence line with Martinez, which was expected to take most of the morning. She was in the kitchen working on the week's supply order when James appeared in the doorway in his riding coat, hat in hand. "I'm going to ride out to the Carroll place," he said. "Dad asked me to drop off a letter for Mr. Carroll." "All right," she said. He didn't leave. He turned the hat in his hands, which was, she'd learned, the thing he did when he was working up to something. "James," she said, without looking up, "whatever it is, you can just say it." A pause, then, "Did you know you were going to stay? When you first came?" She set down her pen. That deserved her full attention. "No," she said honestly. "I thought I'd be here a week, maybe 2. But you stayed." "There was work that needed doing," she said. "I stayed to do it." He looked at her with the careful eyes he'd had since September, the ones that measured everything they landed on. "Is that the only reason?" She thought about how to answer that in a way that was true without being more than she'd earned the right to say. "No," she said finally. "But it was the first reason, and it was a good enough reason to start." He nodded slowly. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he was done, and then he said, "My mother used to sit at that desk. When she did the accounts." He wasn't looking at the desk. He was looking at the window. "I used to come and sit in the corner, and she'd give me paper to draw on so I wouldn't interrupt." Amelia did not move or speak. "I haven't been in here much," he said, "since she died." He paused. "I've been in here more lately." "I know," she said. "I don't mind it," he said. "I just wanted you to know I noticed." He put his hat on with a decisiveness that meant the conversation was over for him. "I'll be back before noon." He left, and his horse's hooves went out across the yard, and Amelia sat at the desk where Margaret Blackwood had once sat doing these same accounts, and she looked at the window and breathed in and breathed out and let herself feel the full complicated weight of what had just happened without trying to immediately organize it into something manageable. James Blackwood had just told her that she had replaced something painful with something bearable. He had not said it that way. He was 13 and male and constitutionally unable to say things that directly. But that was what he'd meant, and she understood it, and it sat in her chest with a specific warmth that had nothing to do with the kitchen stove. Ethan came back before noon, which was earlier than she'd expected. He came in through the kitchen door, stamping snow from his boots, pulling off his coat, and he stopped when he saw her face. "What happened?" he said immediately. "Nothing bad?" She stood up from the desk. "James came to talk to me before he left." Ethan went still. "He told me he doesn't mind being in this room," she said. "He told me his mother used to sit at this desk." Ethan set his coat on the hook. His back was to her for a moment, and she could see him taking that in, not performing a reaction, just having one, quietly, the way he did most things. "He talked about her," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Briefly." She paused. "He's been carrying it differently lately. I think he's been holding it tight for a long time, and something is loosening." Ethan turned around. His face was composed, but there was something in the set of it, the specific contained quality of a man holding something he hasn't looked at directly for a while. "He doesn't talk to me about her much," he said. "I've tried." "You can't try," she said gently. "With James, you can only leave the door open. He comes through it when he's ready." Ethan leaned against the counter. He looked tired in a different way than the physical tiredness of a morning's work, the deeper kind. "I know that," he said. "Doesn't make it easier to wait." "No," she said, "it doesn't." He looked at the desk, at the supply order she'd been working on, then at her. "I've been thinking about something," he said. He said it with the particular quality of a man who has been thinking about it for longer than he's about to imply. "All right," she said. "The arrangement we have," he said. What I hired you for. It's been 5 months. Almost exactly, she said. What you're doing now. It's past what I hired you for. He pushed off the counter and came to stand near the desk. Not close, but not across the room either. You're managing the supply chain. You're handling vendor negotiations. Harlan Price's brother asked about you last week. Wanted to know if you were available as a consultant for 2 smaller operations he's advising. He looked at her steadily. You could build something independent on the back of what you've done here, real independent, not just you working for the ranch. She looked at him carefully. Is that what you're suggesting I should do? No, he said. I'm explaining what you could do, so that what I say next isn't... He paused, finding the words with more difficulty than he usually had. So it doesn't look like I'm keeping you here because I need the accounts managed. The kitchen was quiet. The fire in the stove ticked steadily. What are you saying, Ethan? She asked. She used his name the same way he used hers, without the distance of formality, because enough time had passed and enough things had happened that the formality would have been its own kind of dishonesty. He looked at her directly, the way he always looked at things he was serious about, fully, without flinching away. I'm saying I don't want you to leave because the job is done, he said. And I'm saying I'm aware that's not a fair thing to say to someone in your position, because you've been careful, and I respect that care, and I don't want to make it harder than it already is. He stopped, started again. But I've been standing next to something for 5 months, and I'd rather name it than not. She was quiet for long enough that he looked like he regretted starting. Don't regret it, she said. I can see you regretting it. He exhaled once. I'm not good at this. I know. I've noticed. She came around the desk. Not dramatically, just closing the distance between them to something more honest. You're very good at cattle and fences and knowing when a storm is coming. You're less good at the part where you say what you mean to people. Margaret always said that. She was right. A pause. What exactly are you naming? He looked at her. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her on the train platform. Not with pity, not with evaluation, but with the full attention of a man who saw what was actually there. That this house is different since September, he said. That I come in at the end of the day and it feels like coming in somewhere. That James talked about his mother to you and didn't talk to me, and I'm not jealous of that. I'm relieved, because it means he's talking. He paused. That Lily is making you a quilt. I know about the quilt, she said. That I know why you stayed, he said. And I know it wasn't strategy, and I know it wasn't desperation, and I know what it cost you to build anything here after what September was. And I think... He stopped. I think you deserve to know that I see that. All of it. Amelia had spent 5 months being careful. Being careful had been the correct instinct. It had protected her from assuming, from building on unconfirmed ground, from making herself vulnerable in a situation that already had too many variables. The care had been right, but the man standing in front of her had gone to the bank with her and set her name to lawyers, and told Carol the supply work was hers, and stood in a yard in January and said, I'm not going to stand aside and let that happen. And all of it had been done without a single word about what it meant to him personally, and now he was using those words imperfectly, with the halting quality of someone who didn't have much practice with them. She thought about what she'd told Lily about faces and memory, that the feeling of a thing stays even when the details blur. I know you see it, she said. You've been showing me for 5 months. He looked at her. You're not good with words, she said, but you're consistent, and I trust consistency more than words. Amelia. I'm not finished, she said. Not sharp, just clear. I came here to marry someone I thought I knew from letters, and it went wrong, and I ended up in your house, and I told myself I was here for the work, and then I told myself I was here for the work plus the children, and then I stopped being able to say clearly what I was here for, which is... She paused. Not a state I'm comfortable in. I know, he said. But I'm still here, she said. That's the fact of it. I'm still here, and I stopped thinking about Ohio, and I know where everything is in this house without trying. And when Lily finishes that quilt, I'm going to hang it in my room, and those are things I did without deciding to. She looked at him. I think that's what you're naming. He was quiet. Yes, he said. The kitchen held them both for a moment. She reached out and put her hand on the desk between them. Not toward him, just resting there. A steadying gesture, the kind you make when the ground has shifted under you and you need a moment to check your footing. "I'm not ready to call it something yet," she said. "I need you to understand that." "I do," he said. I'm not saying no to anything," she said. "I'm saying I'm still building the ground under me. And I'm asking you to let me finish." He looked at her hand on the desk, and then at her face, and he nodded once. A single, clear acknowledgement that meant he had heard and understood and would hold to it. "Take the time you need," he said. She nodded. She picked up her pen and looked at the supply order, which was not finished. He poured himself coffee and went to stand at the window, looking out at the yard. And they stayed like that for a while in a silence that was, she thought, the most honest thing that had happened in this kitchen since September. March came like a door opening. The cold broke in the second week, not all at once, but in pieces. A day warmer than the one before, then two. Then a morning where Amelia stepped off the porch and smelled the particular wet earth smell of ground beginning to soften. The valley lost its compressed, white, bright quality and went to brown and gray, and then the first tentative green at the edges of things, where meltwater ran. The ranch expanded again with the season, hands returning, cattle to move, decisions compressing into shorter windows as spring work piled up. Ethan was busy in the way he was only busy in the operational shoulder seasons, present and not present simultaneously, his mind half in the yard even when his body was at the dinner table. Amelia had more on her desk than she'd had all winter. The Carroll conversation happened. Mr. Carroll came out to the ranch on a Tuesday afternoon and spent 2 hours at the study desk with her looking at his supply arrangements, and left with 3 specific recommendations and an agreement to consult further. She had charged him a fee, modest, clearly articulated, not apologized for, and he had paid it without negotiating, which told her she had priced herself correctly. She told Ethan that evening. "Good," he said. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. "I've been thinking about how to structure it," she said, "if other ranchers approach me, whether to formalize it." "You should," he said. "Harlan Price can advise you on the legal structure, and you'd want to be careful about conflicts of interest with our supply arrangements." "I've already thought about that," she said. "I'd need to be transparent with you about any client whose supply chain overlaps with ours." "That's right." He looked at her across the desk. "You've been working this out for a while." "Since February," she said. "Since you told me about Carol." He nodded. He picked up his coffee cup and held it without drinking from it. "You know what this means," he said. "It means I'm not dependent on this position for income," she said, "which means if I stay because I choose to, not because I need to." "Yes," he said. She understood what he was doing. He was building her an exit, not because he wanted her to use it, but because she couldn't honestly choose to stay if leaving wasn't real. A choice made from necessity wasn't a choice. He understood that about her, which was, she thought straightforwardly and without trying to make it romantic, one of the things that had been accumulating in her, slowly, since October. The man understood her. Not perfectly. He got things wrong sometimes, made assumptions, moved too fast on some things, and too slow on others. He was not a simple person to live alongside. But the understanding was there, and it was genuine, and she had not had that before in a way that counted. "I'm going to stay," she said. He looked at her. "Not because the work isn't done," she said. "Not because I don't have somewhere else to go. Because this is where I want to be." She held his gaze. "I'm telling you so you know it's a decision." The expression on his face was the one she'd been trying to name for 5 months, and she finally understood what it was. It was what a person looked like when they were seen accurately and knew it. Not surprised exactly, just recognized. "All right," he said. His voice was even, but only just. "Also," she said, picking up her pen, "the South Paddock fence estimate came in and it's too high. I think we can do better with a different supplier." He looked at her for one more moment, that specific look. And then he set down his coffee cup and pulled his chair around to look at the estimate with her. And they worked through the numbers side by side in the early evening light, talking about board feet and labor costs and spring timing, and the conversation was entirely practical and entirely insufficient as a description of what was happening in that room. But that was all right. Some things moved at their own pace, and Amelia had learned over the past 5 months that the things worth having usually did. Outside, the valley was greening at its edges, and Lily was working on the 7th row of the quilt she'd said was for Amelia's room. And James had started coming to the kitchen in the mornings before Ethan was up, sitting at the table with his coffee and sometimes talking and sometimes not. And the ranch was running better than it had in 3 years, and the accounts were straight, and the pipes had held through the whole winter without incident. These were the facts of the thing, and the facts, taken together, made a picture that Amelia Whitmore was no longer trying not to see. She was home. She had built it herself, out of what was available, one practical decision at a time. And tomorrow there would be more work, and more decisions, and more pieces of a life being assembled in the ordinary, imperfect, necessary way that lives actually get assembled. She was not afraid of that. She had never been afraid of work. Spring arrived the way it always does in Wyoming. Not gently, not all at once, but in arguments with itself, warm days interrupted by cold snaps, mud that froze overnight and softened again by noon, the kind of weather that made you plan in pencil because the land reserved the right to change its mind. Amelia had learned to plan in pencil. It had taken her longer than she'd like to admit. She had come from Ohio with a pencil and ink mind, the kind that made decisions and committed to them and didn't appreciate being reversed by circumstances. But 5 months of frontier winter and one train platform and one January yard with 2 lawyers in it had done what Ohio's 26 years had not quite managed. She held things more loosely now. Not because she cared less, but because she understood more clearly that the difference between a plan and an outcome was where most of the actual living happened. The South Paddock fence went in during the first week of April, with the alternative supplier she'd found and the revised estimate she'd negotiated down by 14%. Ethan had watched the crew work from the fence line one morning and said, without preamble, "You were right about the supplier." That was all. She had said, "I know," and they had both gone back to what they were doing. The Carroll consulting arrangement formalized in March, a clean one-page agreement that Harlan Price reviewed and called sound. 2 other ranch operations in the valley had since contacted her. Word traveled fast in places where interesting things were scarce, and she had taken on one and declined the other because the other would have put her in a direct conflict with Blackwood supply arrangements that she wasn't willing to navigate around. She had told that rancher plainly why she was declining. He had seemed surprised by the directness, and then, after a moment, had seemed to respect it. She had her own income now. Not large, but real and growing and entirely hers. She had opened an account at Price's bank in her own name, which had required a conversation with the teller that was slightly more involved than it should have been, and which she had navigated with the patience of someone who has learned to save her energy for fights that matter. The account was real. Her name was on it. That meant something. More than she'd expected it to, when she finally held the small paper receipt in her hand and stood outside the bank on a Tuesday afternoon in March. The question came from Lily, which was fitting because Lily had always been the one to ask things directly. It was an evening in early April, the 3 of them in the kitchen after supper. Ethan at the far end of the table with a map he was marking up, James at the other end pretending to read but actually watching Amelia help Lily with her arithmetic, a habit he'd developed over the winter of being present in rooms without technically participating in what was happening in them. Lily looked up from her slate in the middle of a long division problem and said, "Are you going to marry my father?" James looked up. Ethan's pencil stopped moving. Amelia kept her expression level. "That's an interesting thing to ask in the middle of long division." "I've been thinking about it for a while," Lily said. "I just decided now was when to ask." "Lily," Ethan said. "I want to know," Lily said. She looked at Amelia with the clear-eyed attention she gave to things she considered important. "Because Clara's mother says you're going to leave eventually, and I told Clara's mother she was wrong, but I don't actually know if she's wrong." The kitchen was very quiet. Amelia set down her pencil and looked at Lily directly, because the girl had asked a direct question and deserved a direct answer, and because she was 8 years old and had lost her mother, and that fact sat at the center of this conversation, whether anyone said so or not. "Clara's mother doesn't know what she's talking about," Amelia said. "I'm not leaving." "But are you going to marry him?" Lily pressed. "Lily," Ethan's voice was firmer. It's all right, Amelia said. She looked at Lily. I don't know yet, she said honestly, but I know I'm staying. Those are two different questions, and I can answer the second one clearly, even if I can't answer the first one yet. Lily considered this with the solemnity of someone running the math. Okay, she said finally. That's fair. She looked back at her slate. I still think you should. Lily, James said, which was the first time he'd spoken. What? She should, Lily said without looking up. He's better when she's here. You are too. James looked at his book. His ears had gone red. Ethan was looking at the map, but he was not seeing the map. Amelia could tell by the way his pencil was not moving and had not moved since Lily started talking. She picked her pencil back up. Finish the problem, she told Lily. Then we'll do the next one. You didn't say I was wrong, Lily pointed out. Finish the problem, Amelia said. Lily finished the problem. It was correct. Well, Ethan found her on the porch later that night, which had become, without either of them formally establishing it, the place where conversations happened that were too large for the kitchen and too serious for the study. The night was cold still, April cold rather than February cold, with the smell of wet earth underneath it, and the first insects starting up somewhere in the darkness near the creek. He leaned on the railing beside her, and they looked at the valley for a while without speaking, and she waited because she could tell he was working toward something. She's not wrong, he said. What Lily said. I know, Amelia said. I'm better. He said it simply, without dressing it up. James is better. The house is... It's a house again, not just a place where we're keeping ourselves until the next season. He paused. I know you said you needed time. I've been trying to give it to you. You have, she said. You've been patient. I'm not patient by nature, he said. I want you to know that. I've been working at it. I know that too. She looked at the dark outline of the hills. You're better at cattle than people. You said so yourself. Margaret always said my problem was I decided things too fast and then felt too sure about them. He was quiet for a moment. She was right. I decided about her fast too. It worked out, but it wasn't because of my patience. What happened with her? Amelia asked. She had not asked before. Had let it be the thing he offered in pieces when he was ready. You've said things in passing, but I don't know the whole of it. He was quiet for a long enough moment that she thought he might not answer. Then, she was the daughter of a cattleman in Colorado. Her father and I did business for 2 years. I met her 4 times over those 2 years and married her on the 5th meeting. He exhaled slowly. She came here and she worked as hard as anyone I've known, and she built things here, the children, the house, the way the operation ran, and she did it without complaint and without asking for more than she got, which was not always enough. He stopped. She deserved more than I was good at giving. Amelia looked at him. She knew I loved her, he said. I want to be clear about that. But I was not always present. I was here, and I was working, and I thought that was the same thing as being present, and it's not. He looked at his hands on the railing. When she got sick, it was fast, 8 days between the first fever and the end, and I spent 4 of those days convinced it wasn't serious because I needed it to not be serious, and by the time I understood what was happening, there was nothing left to do. His voice was even throughout this. She knew by now that evenness was not the absence of feeling with him. It was just how the feeling sat. I'm sorry, she said, and she meant it the way she'd meant it before, plainly, without decoration. I know, he said. The reason I'm telling you is... He paused. I don't want to do that again. Not the losing. I know you can't prevent that, but the part where I'm here and not present, I'm trying to learn the difference. He turned to look at her. You make it easier to know the difference. She looked at him in the dark. This man who was good at land and cattle and stubborn silences and standing in yards without flinching, and who was working visibly and with effort at the things that didn't come naturally. I'm not Margaret, she said. No, he said. You're not. That's not what I... He stopped. I'm not looking for her again. I'm not asking you to be anything except what you are. Which is? Difficult, he said. Specific. Better at my accounts than I am. Not interested in being managed. He paused. Exactly what this place needed, without looking anything like what I thought I needed. She almost smiled. That's the most honest description of me I've heard. I'm better at honest than smooth, he said. I know, she said. I've liked that about you since January. He looked at her. In the yard, she said. When you told Victor you weren't going to stand aside, you didn't perform it. You just said it and meant it. She paused. That's hard to find. The night held them both for a moment. The creak made its sound in the dark. Somewhere in the barn, one of the horses shifted. I'm asking you something, he said. Not a question yet. A signal that one was coming, giving her the moment to prepare. I know, she said. I want to do this right, he said. And I know I'm not always right about what right looks like. But I'm asking you, not because the house needs someone, not because the children need someone, not because it makes business sense or because you have nowhere else to go. You have somewhere else to go. You have several somewheres. He held her gaze. I'm asking because this is where I want you, and I think it's where you want to be. And I think we're both too practical to say that any plainer than that. Amelia had thought about this moment, not in the way of building fantasies, but in the way she thought about everything, practically, with an eye to what she actually had versus what she was imagining. She had thought about what it would mean to say yes to anything here, what she would be agreeing to and what it would cost and what it would give. She had thought about the bench on the train platform and the bag with the bent clasp and $73 and no plan. She had thought about the desk in the study and the supply ledgers and Lily's quilt squares and James carrying a tray without being asked. She had thought about January's yard and February's social and the account at Price's Bank with her name on it. What she had built here was not what she had come for. It was harder than what she'd come for and more real than what she'd come for, and she had built it with what she had, incrementally, the way you build anything that lasts. And the man standing beside her had stood next to the building of it without trying to take it over and without stepping back when it cost him something. That was not a small thing. That was, in fact, the only thing that mattered. Ask me plainly, she said. He looked at her for a moment, then, will you marry me? Yes, she said. Not dramatically. Not with her hands shaking or her voice breaking or any of the things that the occasion might theoretically have called for. Just yes, clearly, the way she said everything she'd decided. He exhaled once, slowly, the breath of a man who has been holding something for a long time and has finally set it down. All right, he said. All right, she agreed. They stood on the porch for another few minutes in the cold, not touching yet, just standing beside each other in the way they'd been standing beside each other for months, close enough to matter, with enough space to be themselves. And that felt to Amelia like exactly the right way to start something. They told the children at breakfast. Lily burst into immediate and total vindication. I knew it, she announced, to no one and everyone. I told Clara's mother and she was wrong, and I knew it. She looked at Amelia with an expression of profound satisfaction. You should have said yes when I asked. I didn't know the answer yet when you asked, Amelia said. You did know, Lily said. You just weren't ready to say. Amelia looked at this 8-year-old who had been sitting beside her with quilt squares and arithmetic since November and thought that she was probably right. James was quiet, which was expected, and Amelia watched him across the table during the rest of breakfast without being obvious about it. He ate, he drank his coffee. He had started having coffee in the mornings, which was either a growing-up thing or a ranch hand influence, and Amelia had said nothing about it. He listened to Lily announce herself correct twice more. When he got up to go, he stopped beside Amelia's chair and put his hand on the back of it briefly. Not a hug, not a word, just a hand on the back of her chair for 2 seconds, and then he was out the door and across the yard toward the barn. Ethan looked at her. I know, she said. That's more than he's... Ethan stopped. I know, she said again. The wedding was in May, which was Amelia's suggestion because May in the Valley was, by universal consensus, the best thing Wyoming produced. She wanted something simple, and she got something simple. The long room at the community hall, 40 people, food made partly by Mrs. Carver and partly by the ranch kitchen, Lily in a dress she'd chosen herself and refused to change despite its being slightly too warm for the afternoon, Mrs. Carver arrived early and looked Amelia over with the assessing eye she'd used since that first hotel conversation in September and said, "Good. Just that. Good." Then she went to organize the food because things needed organizing and she was the person to do it. Helen Sutton, the plain-spoken woman from the winter social who had become, over the following months, something close to an actual friend, fixed Amelia's hair with pins and said, "You look like yourself," which is the right thing to look like at a wedding. "I've been trying," Amelia said. "You've managed it," Helen said. "Most women don't." Harlan Price was there with his wife. Martinez was there with his. Carol attended and shook Amelia's hand with the same directness she'd shown him at their first meeting, which she appreciated. Two of the families she'd grown careful relationships with over the winter were there. People who had started simply as neighbors and had become gradually something closer to a community, which was not the same as friends but was also not nothing. Frances Eldridge was there. Amelia had not expected that. She had not invited her and had not uninvited her either, because the community hall events were open to the community, and she was not going to spend energy managing who attended her own wedding. But Frances was there, standing near the back, and when Amelia walked past her at one point in the afternoon, the woman said, "Congratulations, Miss Whitmore." "It's Mrs. Blackwood now," Amelia said without stopping. "But thank you." She did not look back to see Frances's expression. Some things didn't need to be witnessed. Bucked out. Ethan was not a man for speeches. She had known that. The justice of the peace said the words that needed saying, and Ethan said the words that were required, and she said hers, and what passed between them in the moment after was not something that translates into words anyway. Just two people who had been paying close attention to each other for 8 months and had finally said it out loud in front of witnesses. He kissed her, which was brief and a little clumsy and absolutely right. James, standing behind them, made a sound that might have been embarrassment and might have been something else. Lily whispered, loud enough that the first 3 rows heard, "Finally." She thought about the train later. She thought about it the way you think about the moment before a thing changed. Not with nostalgia, which would have been dishonest, but with the particular attention you give to a pivot point once you can see clearly what it pivoted into. She had been so certain she understood what she was going toward. 8 months of letters had felt like enough. Enough to know a person, enough to build a plan on. She had been thorough about it, careful, had asked the questions she thought to ask, had read the answers as well as she could read anything. And she had still been wrong, because you cannot know a person from letters, and you cannot know what a life will be from the shape you've imagined for it. What happened instead was a bench, and a woman sitting on it trying to work out what was next, and a man who had not looked at her with pity. She had not been saved. She wanted to be clear about that in her own mind. It mattered that she was clear about it. No one had rescued her from the platform. She had sat there and thought practically, and gone to a hotel and started doing the work available to her, and made decisions one at a time, and those decisions had compounded into other decisions, and 5 months in she had looked up from the supply ledgers and found herself somewhere she hadn't planned to be. That was not rescue. That was her own work, followed wherever it led. What Ethan had offered from the beginning, from that first conversation on the platform, was not salvation. It was space. A fair exchange, a door left open, a position taken beside her rather than over or under her. He had said you deserve respect without saying those words, by simply treating her as someone who did, and in a year when the most powerful man she'd known had stood on a public platform and treated her as something to be returned, that distinction had mattered enormously. She thought about this not because she was sentimental about it, but because she thought it was true and important and worth understanding clearly. The things that saved you were rarely the dramatic interventions. They were usually the small, consistent acts of a person deciding, again and again, to see you accurately and treat you accordingly. Ethan Blackwood was not a hero. He was a tired widower with a difficult son and a fearless daughter, and 12,000 acres and a tendency to work too long without coming inside. He was specific and imperfect, and occasionally so certain about things that she wanted to argue with him, which she did, because she was also specific and imperfect, and occasionally too certain. They argued, it turned out, more than she'd expected. About the operation, about the children, about decisions made without enough consultation, about his tendency to decide fast and feel too sure, about her tendency to hold information until she had the complete picture when sometimes he needed the partial picture now. They were not natural partners in temperament. They were complementary, which was different. The fit of two things shaped differently but made to work in the same space, each covering what the other didn't. That was not the story she'd built in Ohio from 41 letters. It was harder than that story, and less smooth, and considerably more real. She preferred it. The summer that followed was the fullest she had known. The consulting work grew. By July, she had 4 clients outside the Blackwood operation, all of them referrals, all of them coming to her specifically. She had hired a part-time bookkeeper to handle the repetitive portions so she could focus on the analysis and negotiation, which were the parts she was actually good at. Harlan Price suggested in August that she consider formalizing as a proper enterprise, a name, a structure, something the territory's growing commercial class could engage with officially. She was thinking about it. The ranch ran the best season it had run in years. Not because of any single decision, but because of the accumulated effect of 8 months of good management, which was, as Amelia had always understood, how things actually improved. Not through dramatic intervention, but through sustained attention to the details that mattered. James turned 14 in June. He was taller than she'd noticed him becoming. The growth of the past year had settled into something more like the man he'd eventually be, long-limbed and quiet and more capable than he showed. He had started helping with the supply decisions, which had begun as her asking him questions and had evolved into him offering observations that were genuinely useful. He had his father's instinct for land and his mother's, she'd learned this gradually, patience for detail. He called her Amelia, not mother, and she had never asked him to do otherwise. Margaret was his mother. She was something else, and what that something else was did not need a word to be real. Lily finished the quilt for Amelia's room in July and presented it with the ceremony of someone delivering something long promised. It was not perfect. The 4th row had a slight drift in it, and 2 of the corner squares were marginally uneven. But it was finished, which was its own form of achievement, and Amelia hung it on the wall above the washstand and looked at it every morning and thought about small hands working at corners and the patience it took to see a thing through. There was one more thing that needed settling, and it settled itself on an August evening with the particular ordinariness of most things that matter. She was in the study, her study now as much as Ethan's, a shift that had happened so gradually that neither of them had announced it, working on the quarterly summary for the Carroll operation, when Ethan came in and sat in the chair across the desk, not to work, just to sit, which he sometimes did now. "I had a letter," he said. She looked up. "From Victor Hale's lawyer," he said. "Not a threat, a formality, confirming that all claims from the original contract are formally withdrawn and the matter is considered closed." He set the letter on the desk. "Dated 3 weeks ago. Must have been slow coming through." Amelia looked at the letter. She did not pick it up. "Are you all right?" Ethan asked. "Yes," she said. And she was. She checked herself against the question honestly, the way she checked the accounts, looking for something that didn't add up, some residue of what that man had put her through, and found mostly just the tired satisfaction of a thing being finally, formally done. "It's been over since January," she said. "This is just the paperwork." "I know." He paused. "I wanted to ask anyway." She looked at him across the desk. This man who asked anyway, who checked in, who had learned, imperfectly and with effort, the difference between being present and being in the room. "Victor made a decision," she said, "that I thought at the time was the worst thing that had happened to me, standing on that platform, and it turned out to be—" She stopped. "Not good. It wasn't good. It was humiliating, and it cost me more than it should have." She paused. "But it was also the thing that brought me here, and I can't wish it undone." Ethan was quiet, watching her. "That's not a lesson," she said. "I don't think hard things are secretly good things in disguise. Some hard things are just hard." She looked at the letter. "But sometimes a wrong road gets you to the right place, and you just have to be honest about both parts of that." He reached across the desk and put his hand over hers. Not a large gesture. Just his hand on hers, warm and solid and specific, the way he did everything. "You came 3,000 miles, he said. "I did," she said. "You ended up 6 miles east of where you started." "I know." She turned her hand over under his. "Funny how that works." Outside, the August evening was settling over the valley, that particular golden quality of light in the last hour before dark, when the hills went from brown to amber and the sky behind them went from blue to a color that didn't have a name. The ranch was quiet, in the way it was quiet at this hour. Not empty, not still, just the natural pause between the day's work and whatever the night brought. Lily was somewhere inside working on a new quilt, a third one, this time with a pattern she had designed herself. James had been out on the range since morning and would be back before dark because he was reliable that way, more reliable than he knew. The horses were in the barn, the accounts were straight, the fences held. This was not the life Amelia Whitmore had planned. It was the life she had built, out of a collapsed plan and a platform bench and $73, and the particular stubbornness of a woman who refused to cry in front of people who wanted to see her broken. She had not waited to be chosen. She had not waited to be saved. She had sat on that bench for 30 seconds and let herself feel the full weight of what had gone wrong, and then she had picked up her bag and started making decisions. That was all. That was, in the end, the entire thing. People want to believe that the turning point is the dramatic moment, the man who steps forward, the legal threat defeated, the wedding in May. But those were the visible things, the ones you could point to. The actual turning point was a woman alone on a bench deciding that she was not going to let this be the end of her story. Everything else followed from that. That was what she understood now, in a way she hadn't understood it at 26 on a platform in September. You cannot always control what happens to you. Victor Hale had made a decision that upended everything she'd planned, and he had done it carelessly and publicly and without adequate regard for the cost to her, and that had been genuinely wrong, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. Life is not fair in its distribution of hard things, and hard things are not secretly gifts, and the people who do damage to you are not the instruments of your improvement. But what you do on the bench afterward, that is entirely yours. She had done something with it. She had gotten up and gone to work and stayed honest and stayed herself and not let the hardness make her smaller. That was the thing worth naming, not the happy ending, but the decision that made the ending possible. Ethan's hand was warm over hers on the desk. The study was full of evening light. Somewhere in the valley, her valley now, the creek made its sound, and the horses settled, and the hills went amber, and the day finished itself in the ordinary, irreplaceable way that good days do. Without announcement, without ceremony, just the quiet accumulation of a life being lived by someone who had decided, a long time ago on a September platform, that she was worth the trouble of living it. She squeezed his hand once. He squeezed back. That was enough. That was in fact everything.